The blood ran in rivers across Munich's cobblestones as the executioner's axe fell for the 47th time that morning. The crowd had long since stopped cheering. Even the bloodthirsty spectators were horrified by what they were witnessing. This wasn't just an execution, it was a massacre sanctioned by law, a legal crime that would haunt Germany for centuries. The year was 1600, and what happened in Munich's Marienplatz that day would go down as one of the most horrific displays of judicial brutality in European history. But how did it come to this? How did a single accusation turn into a bloodbath that would scar an entire nation? The horror began with Anna Pemb, a midwife from the village of Schongau, just outside Munich. In the superstitious world of late 16th century Bavaria, midwives occupied a precarious position. They were essential to society, helping women through childbirth, but they were also viewed with suspicion. Their intimate knowledge of herbs, their presence at life's most vulnerable moments, and their ability to save or lose lives made them natural targets for witchcraft accusations. Anna Pemb had served her community faithfully for decades, delivering hundreds of babies and earning the respect of local families. But in 1589, when several infants died during difficult births, whispers began to spread. The deaths were tragic, but not unusual. Infant mortality was devastatingly high in the 16th century. Yet, in a world where people desperately needed someone to blame for their losses, Anna became the perfect scapegoat. The accusation started small. A grieving mother claimed Anna had cursed her child. A jealous rival suggested Anna's success came from supernatural sources. Soon, the whispers became roars, and Anna Pemb found herself dragged before the courts of Bavaria, charged with practicing witchcraft and murdering infants through supernatural means. What followed was a legal nightmare that would expose the darkest aspects of German justice. The trial wasn't about evidence or truth. It was about extracting confessions through torture and finding as many accomplices as possible. Under the brutal interrogation methods of the time, Anna eventually confessed to impossible crimes, flying through the air to attend witches' sabbaths, having sexual relations with the devil, and murdering dozens of children through magical means. But Anna's confession was just the beginning. The authorities demanded she name her accomplices, and under continued torture, she began accusing other women in the region. Each new name led to another arrest, another trial, another set of confessions extracted through agony. The witch hunt spread like wildfire through the Bavarian countryside, consuming innocent lives in its path. By 1600, the prisons of Munich were overflowing with accused witches. The legal system had become a machine of terror, processing suspects with ruthless efficiency. Judges competed to see who could extract the most confessions. Executioners worked overtime to keep up with the death sentences, and the entire region lived in fear of denunciation. The case that would culminate in the Munich Square Massacre involved dozens of women from across Bavaria. They ranged in age from teenage girls to elderly grandmothers, representing every social class and background. What they had in common was their vulnerability. They were widows, outcasts, healers, or simply women who had made enemies in their communities. The trial proceedings were a mockery of justice. The accused were subjected to torture devices that would make modern observers sick with horror. The strappado, where victims were suspended by their arms tied behind their backs, was considered mild compared to the thumbscrews, leg crushers, and red-hot pincers used to extract confessions. Women were forced to implicate their own daughters, mothers, and sisters to end their suffering. The confessions that emerged from these torture sessions painted a picture of an elaborate satanic conspiracy spanning the entire region. According to the official record, hundreds of women had been attending witches' sabbaths, poisoning wells, destroying crops, and murdering children through supernatural means. The scale of the supposed conspiracy was so vast that it seemed to justify the extraordinary measures being taken against it. Duke Maximilian I of Bavaria, the ruler who would ultimately authorize the mass execution, was a deeply religious man who genuinely believed he was protecting his people from supernatural evil. He had studied theology, surrounded himself with Jesuit advisors, and saw the witch hunt as a holy crusade against the forces of darkness. To him, the confessions proved that Bavaria was under attack by Satan himself, and only the most extreme measures could save the duchy. The death sentences were pronounced with grim ceremony. 47 women were condemned to die, their crimes read aloud in a litany of supposed supernatural offenses. The method of execution, beheading by axe, was considered merciful compared to burning, which was the traditional punishment for witches. But mercy was relative when applied to so many victims at once. The date chosen for the mass execution was October 31st, 1600, All Hallows' Eve, when the veil between the world of the living and the dead was supposedly thinnest. The symbolism was deliberate. These women would die on the night associated with witchcraft, their deaths serving as a final triumph over the forces of evil. Munich's Marienplatz was transformed into a scene from hell. Scaffolds were erected, crowds gathered, and the machinery of death was prepared for its grisly work. The square, normally a place of commerce and celebration, became an altar of judicial sacrifice, where dozens of innocent lives would be offered up to the paranoia of the age. The execution began at dawn. One by one, the condemned women were led to the scaffold, their sentences read aloud, and their heads severed with the executioner's axe. The crowd initially cheered each death, viewing it as justice served against enemies of God and society. But as the mourning wore on and the bodies piled up, even the bloodthirsty spectators began to feel sick. Contemporary accounts describe the horror that unfolded. The executioner, exhausted from his grim work, began to make mistakes. Some women required multiple blows to kill, their dying screams echoing across the square. The blood pooled so deeply that it ran between the cobblestones like rivers, creating a crimson carpet that horrified even hardened observers. By noon, 47 women were dead, their bodies piled like cordwood in the center of Munich's most famous square. The crowd dispersed in stunned silence, many wondering if they had witnessed justice or atrocity. The stench of blood and death hung over the city for days, a tangible reminder of what had been done in the name of law and order. The aftermath was immediate and devastating. News of the Munich Massacre spread across Europe, shocking even societies accustomed to brutal public executions. Other rulers began to question their own witch-hunting policies, wondering if they too had gone too far in their pursuit of supernatural criminals. Within Bavaria itself, the psychological impact was profound. Families had been destroyed, communities torn apart, and trust shattered. The surviving relatives of the executed women lived under a cloud of suspicion, their lives forever marked by association with convicted witches. Many fled the region, unable to bear the stigma of their connections to the victims. Duke Maximilian, initially proud of his decisive action against witchcraft, gradually began to have doubts. Reports reached him of similar mass executions in other regions, and the sheer scale of the supposed conspiracy began to seem implausible. How could so many women have been involved in such elaborate supernatural schemes without anyone noticing until the trials began? The legal system itself began to crack under the weight of its own contradictions. The confessions extracted through torture were so fantastical that even believers in witchcraft started to question their reliability. If these women could really fly through the air and command supernatural powers, how had they been so easily captured and tortured into submission? Modern historians recognize the Munich Massacre as a tragic example of how fear and superstition can corrupt even well-intentioned legal systems. The 47 women who died were almost certainly innocent of the crimes for which they were executed. They were victims of a perfect storm of religious hysteria, legal incompetence, and social paranoia that turned neighbors into enemies and justice into vengeance. The legacy of that bloody day in Munich Square extended far beyond Bavaria's borders. The massacre became a symbol of the dangers of unchecked judicial power and the importance of due process. Legal scholars across Europe began to question the methods used to extract confessions and the reliability of testimony obtained through torture. The square itself bore the scars of that day for generations. Locals claimed the cobblestones remained stained with blood despite repeated cleaning, and many avoided the area after dark, believing it to be haunted by the spirits of the executed women. Some reported seeing ghostly figures walking across the square on Halloween night, eternal reminders of the injustice that had been done. Within a generation, the great witch hunts of Europe began to wane. The Munich Massacre played a role in this decline, serving as a cautionary tale about the dangers of mass hysteria and judicial overreach. Courts began to require higher standards of evidence. Torture was gradually restricted, and the supernatural explanations for everyday tragedies became less acceptable. The women who died in Munich Square were eventually recognized as victims rather than criminals. Their names, carefully recorded in the trial documents, became a memorial to the innocent lives lost to fear and superstition. Modern Munich has acknowledged this dark chapter in its history, with memorials and historical markers recognizing the tragedy that unfolded in the heart of the city. The horror of Munich Square serves as a permanent reminder of what happens when fear overwhelms reason, when the desire for simple explanations leads to complex injustices, and when the machinery of law is turned into an instrument of terror. Those 47 women died not for their crimes, but for their society's inability to accept that sometimes tragedy has no supernatural explanation. Sometimes evil is purely human. Their screams echoed across that cobblestone square for a few terrible hours in 1600, but their story echoes still, a warning from the grave about the price of abandoning justice in the pursuit of vengeance.